They thought Clara Hayes was only a widow. They thought grief had made her weak, poverty had made her powerless, and the mountain would swallow her before she ever became a threat. But they were wrong. Beneath her mourning dress was a woman with a mind sharper than a blade and a heart that refused to surrender. Sent to Pine Ridge as if her life meant nothing, Clara walked straight into the storm, not to die, but to uncover the truth her husband was murdered for. If Clara's courage moved you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful Western stories.
4 in the morning, black as pitch. Pine Ridge Outpost wasn't a place a man lived. It was a place a man survived. Up here, where the Colorado timberline scraped the sky, the wind didn't just blow. It howled. It carried teeth. It tore through the chinks in the heavy pine logs and settled right deep into your marrow. Silas Vance stood over the water trough. He held a heavy iron bar in his gloved hands. He brought it down. Crack. The ice splintered, jagged white lines webbed across the frozen surface. He lifted the iron, brought it down again. Crack. 1,461 days. That's how long it had been. Exactly 4 years to the day. Silas didn't keep a paper calendar pinned to the cabin wall. He didn't need to. He kept the tally in his head. The numbers ticked by with every breath he took, with every brutal swing of the iron bar. Crack. The ice gave way. Black, freezing water spilled over the wooden brim, soaking the hem of his heavy wool coat. Silas didn't flinch. He just dropped the iron bar into the snow and plunged his bucket into the freezing depths. He welcomed the bite of the cold. The numbness was a mercy. It kept his mind grounded in the physical world. It kept him from seeing the face. But the face was always there, waiting in the quiet. A man, unarmed, falling backward into the dirt. The deafening roar of Silas's own revolver echoing in the dark. Silas pulled the heavy bucket out of the trough. Water sloshed over his boots, freezing almost instantly in the frigid morning air. He was the sheriff of this territory. But he was up here, a full day's hard ride from town, by his own choosing. Pine Ridge was the end of the line, a border outpost built for forgotten men. It was his penance. You can't put yourself behind bars when you wear the badge, so Silas had built a prison out of isolation and ice. A sharp sound cut through the howling wind. Hoofbeats, muffled by the heavy snow but steady. Approaching. Silas set the bucket down. He didn't reach for the Colt strapped to his hip. He didn't need to. Only one fool in the entire territory rode up this mountain pass before the sun broke the horizon. A dark shape materialized through the swirling snow. A rider on a sturdy roan gelding. Gideon Brooks. The deputy slid out of the saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed snow with a heavy thud. Gideon was a broad-shouldered, free black man who knew the high country better than the timber wolves did. More importantly, he knew Silas. He was the only man who still looked the sheriff in the eye without flinching. Gideon didn't ask questions about the past. He just showed up, usually with bad news. "Cold enough to freeze a ghost out here, Silas," Gideon called out, his breath plumed in the dark air like train smoke. He patted his horse's neck, knocking a thick layer of snow off the animal's mane. Silas just grunted. He picked up his water bucket. "Coffee's inside. Get the horse in the shed. I've got the stove going." 10 minutes later, the two men sat inside the main room of the outpost. It was sparse. Rough-hewn tables, a few heavy chairs, and a cast-iron stove that pumped out a desperate dry heat. Silas poured the coffee from a battered tin pot. It was black, thick as river mud. The kind of coffee that woke you up by starting a fire in your gut. Gideon took his tin cup, wrapping both hands around it to soak up the heat. He didn't take a sip right away. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy buffalo coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope. The wax seal on the back was cracked. Town council business. Silas stared at it. He didn't reach for it. "Town's quiet." "Quiet enough," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. "Folks are buckling down. Storm's rolling in from the north. A bad one." But the council held a meeting last night, late, passed a motion. He slid the envelope across the scarred wooden table. They sent a dispatch. Orders for the outpost. Silas picked it up. He broke the rest of the seal with his thumb and unfolded the heavy paper. He held it toward the glow of the kerosene lantern. He read the looping formal script. He read it once. Then he read it again, his jaw tightening. He dropped the paper on the table, looked up at Gideon. A seamstress. Gideon nodded slowly. He finally took a sip of his coffee. That's what they said. Silas let out a harsh, humorless breath. He stood up, pacing the short length of the cabin. A seamstress. Up here? To Pine Ridge? He pointed a finger at the frost-covered window. Gideon, look out there. We're 20 miles from the nearest proper road. The trail is half ice and half rock slide. Grown men, hardened deputies beg for transfers out of this post. And the town council is sending a lone woman up here? Winter's coming fast, Silas, Gideon replied, keeping his voice level. Council argues the outpost patrol tents are shredded. The heavy canvas is torn to ribbons from the wind. Our winter coats are falling apart. Josiah Blackwood led the motion. He told the council it's cheaper to send a woman up here with a needle and heavy thread to mend the lot than it is to buy new gear for the deputies. Silas stopped pacing. The name hung in the air like smoke. Josiah Blackwood. Blackwood owned the mines. He owned the land. And for all intents and purposes, he owned the men who sat on the town council. The man didn't cough without calculating the profit margin. Blackwood doesn't care about the outpost budget, Silas said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. He doesn't care if we freeze. He's pushing somebody out. He's sending a woman up a deadly mountain pass in the middle of a winter storm. Gideon leaned back in his wooden chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He looked at Silas, his dark eyes heavy with the cynical reality of the world they lived in. That's just the way it works down in the valley, Silas, Gideon said softly. You know it as well as I do. To men like Josiah Blackwood, folks without money or name are just lines on a ledger. They're just balancing the books. The laborers in the mines, the widows in the valley, they're just numbers. Cheap labor, cheap lives. Blackwood figures if he sends a poor widowed seamstress up here and she happens to freeze on the pass or gets lost in the timber, it's no real loss to the town. They think her life doesn't carry the same weight as theirs. Just another poor, expendable soul. Silas stood perfectly still. The crackle of the wood inside the iron stove was the only sound in the room. He looked at the fire. The orange flames licked the glass. For a second, he saw the flash of the muzzle again. He felt the cold weight of the revolver in his hand. He remembered what happened 4 years ago when he had listened to the lies of powerful men, when he had acted without questioning. Silas turned slowly. He looked dead into his deputy's eyes. You're wrong, Silas said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was low, iron hard, absolute. And so are they. Gideon stayed quiet, letting the sheriff speak. Silas stepped closer to the table, leaning his weight on his knuckles. A man's life has no tiered value, Gideon. I don't care what Blackwood's ledger says. The poor man and the powerful bleed the exact same red. No one's existence is worth less just because they don't hold the deeds to a silver mine or sit on a velvet chair in the council room. Human life is equal, period. Silas tapped a heavy finger on the silver star pinned to his chest. We wear these badges to protect that equal right to life, especially for the ones the council thinks are expendable. I learned that the hard way, Gideon. I once blindly took a life because I listened to men in power. I let them tell me who was a threat and who wasn't. I let them use me, and an innocent man is in the ground because of it. Silas swallowed hard, his jaw setting into stone. Never again. No one is expendable on my watch. Gideon looked at his friend. The cynical edge faded from the deputy's eyes, replaced by a deep, anchoring respect. He set his coffee cup down. I know, Silas, Gideon said quietly. That's why I rode up here before the sun, to warn you. Silas stood up straight. He looked toward the heavy timber door. The wind was screaming against the outside of the cabin now. The storm wasn't just rolling in, it was already here. "When does the stagecoach arrive?" Silas asked. "Sundown," Gideon replied. "Assuming the driver doesn't turn back. Assuming the storm doesn't swallow the trail entirely." "No driver working for Blackwood is going to turn back," Silas said grimly. He walked over to the corner of the room and grabbed his heavy rifle, checking the lever action purely out of habit. He grabbed his heavy wool coat from the peg on the wall. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked, standing up. "I'm going to chop more firewood," Silas said, pulling his gloves back on. "And then I'm going to clear the snow from the front steps. If Josiah Blackwood thinks he can use this mountain as a graveyard for a woman he wants to throw away, he's gravely mistaken." Silas pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "We're going to keep her alive, Gideon, whatever it takes." Silas opened the heavy door. The freezing wind hit him like a physical blow, swirling snow into the warm cabin. He stepped out into the blinding white dark, pulling the door shut behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed loud. A seamstress was coming to Pine Ridge, and Silas Vance was ready to meet her. The needle felt cold. It was steel, sharp, and unforgiving. Clara Hayes ran her thumb over the blunt end. She placed it into the velvet-lined box. Beside it went the heavy cotton thread, the beeswax for waterproofing, the iron shears. She closed the box. The latch snapped shut. It sounded like a cell door closing. Her breath hitched just for a second. Then she smoothed the front of her black morning dress. 4 years. 4 years of wearing black. The fabric was worn at the elbows now. The town of Oakhaven liked their widows quiet. They liked them invisible. Clara wasn't invisible, and she certainly wasn't quiet. She picked up her small leather valise. Beneath the folded petticoats and the spare wool stockings, there was a small leather-bound notebook. Inside that notebook were dates, names, bank transfers, pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit the official story. The official story said her husband, Arthur, was caught in the crossfire of a bandit raid. Clara knew better. Arthur was a clerk, a man of letters. He didn't wander into gunfights. He was investigating the land grabs around the valley. And then he was dead. Now Josiah Blackwood wanted her gone. The town council's order had arrived yesterday, a mandate. Pine Ridge Outpost needed a seamstress for the winter. The pay was a pittance. The journey was a death sentence. Every woman in town had refused. So they drafted the widow. They gave her 24 hours to pack. Josiah Blackwood thought he was sending a nuisance to freeze on a mountain. He didn't know he was giving her the one thing she desperately needed: access. The Pine Ridge sheriff was the man who pulled the trigger. Silas Vance. He kept the original incident reports. Up there, away from Blackwood's prying eyes, Clara could finally find the truth. She stepped out into the muddy street. The wind was already biting. The stagecoach waited at the edge of town. It wasn't the fine passenger coach. It was the freight line. Rough planks. No glass in the windows, just heavy leather flaps flapping wildly in the wind. The driver was a man named Cobb. He had a thick neck and a mean disposition. He worked for Blackwood's freight company. Cobb spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the frozen mud as she approached. "You the widow Hayes?" "I am," Clara said. Her voice was steady. Cobb eyed her small frame. He laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "You ain't gonna make it past the tree line, lady. Storm's blowing in heavy. But the boss says you go, you go." He grabbed her valise, tossing it onto the roof with no care. Clara didn't flinch. She climbed into the dark, freezing cabin. The journey began. It was a descent into a freezing hell. Hours bled into one another. The coach rattled over frozen ruts. The wooden wheels slammed against stones. Every jolt shot up Clara's spine. The leather flaps did nothing to stop the wind. The cold crept through her thin leather boots. It chewed at her fingers. She wrapped her wool shawl tighter. It wasn't enough. By mid-afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The snow didn't fall. It drove sideways. It was sharp, like shattered glass. The coach hit a deep rut and skidded. The horses screamed. The carriage lurched to a violent halt, throwing Clara against the wooden wall. She tasted blood. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Outside, Cobb was cursing, loud and vicious. He threw open the leather flap. Snow swirled into the cabin, coating Clara's black dress in white. "Get out!" Cobb yelled over the howling wind. "Wheels stuck in a drift. I need weight off the back, and I ain't unhitching the cargo." Clara didn't argue. She stepped down into the snow. It was knee-deep. The cold punched the breath right out of her lungs. "Grab the wheel," Cobb ordered. "When I whip the team, you push." Clara looked at the heavy, mud-caked iron wheel. She looked at her bare hands. She had dropped her gloves inside the coach. "Push, damn it!" Cobb roared. Clara put her hands on the freezing iron. Cobb cracked the whip. The horses lunged. The wheel spun, grinding against the ice. Clara pushed. She put every ounce of her grief, her anger, and her desperate need for the truth into her shoulders. The iron tore at her skin. The wood splintered against her palms. With a sickening lurch, the coach popped free. Clara fell to her knees in the snow. She was gasping. Her hands were raw, scraped, and bleeding. Bright red drops fell onto the pristine white snow. Cobb stomped over to her. He didn't offer a hand. He just sneered. "Look at you," Cobb spat. "Pathetic. This is what happens when women don't know their place. You should be in town, sweeping a floor, serving a man his dinner. Widows ain't got no business being out here. You're just a burden, a fragile little burden." Clara stopped breathing hard. She looked at her bleeding hands. Then she slowly stood up. She brushed the snow from her skirt. She stood straight, ignoring the trembling in her legs. She locked her eyes onto Cobb's. Her gaze was not fragile. It was iron. "A woman's dignity does not depend on her proximity to a man," Clara said. Her voice cut through the howling wind, clear, unshaking. "Respect is a fundamental human right, Mr. Cobb. I demand you speak to me with it, or you will remain completely silent for the remainder of this journey." Cobb blinked. The sheer authority in her voice caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. It was a terrifying kind of calm. He spat into the snow again, muttered a curse, and climbed back onto the driver's bench. Clara got back into the freezing coach. She wrapped her torn, bleeding hands in her shawl. She didn't cry. She just stared at the wooden floorboards. Every mile was taking her closer to the man who killed her husband. She would endure the cold. She would endure the pain. Because the truth was waiting at the top of the mountain. Night had fully fallen when the coach finally groaned to a stop. Clara pushed the leather flap aside. Through the blinding snow, she saw the warm orange glow of a kerosene lantern. A heavy log cabin stood against the tree line. Pine Ridge Outpost. A man was walking toward the coach. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He moved through the waist-deep snow like it was nothing but dust. He wore a heavy buffalo coat. A silver star caught the lantern light on his chest. Sheriff Silas Vance. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was him, the man who pulled the trigger. Silas reached the coach. He opened the door fully. The wind roared around them. He looked up at her. His face was shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see his eyes. They were gray, and they were impossibly tired. "You the seamstress?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than the storm. "I am," Clara said. Silas reached up to help her down. Clara hesitated. Then she extended her hand. Silas gripped her hand to steady her. As she stepped down into the snow, the lantern light hit her skin. Silas stopped. He looked down at the hand he was holding. It was covered in dried blood. Deep, raw scrapes tore across her palms and fingers. Silas's jaw tightened. He looked from her bleeding hands to the driver, Cobb, who was busy unstrapping the luggage. A dark, violent shadow crossed the sheriff's face. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. "Get inside," Silas said softly to Clara. His voice had changed. The gruff edge was gone. "The fire is lit." Clara pulled her hand back. She clutched her shawl. She looked at Silas Vance, the rumored monster of Pine Ridge. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. She nodded once and walked toward the light. The morning light was brutal. It glared off the fresh snow, blindingly white, and poured through the frosted window panes of the outpost. Inside, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. Clara sat by the large stone hearth. A heavy canvas patrol tent was draped across her lap. It was thick, stiff material, smelling of pine sap and old campfires. She pushed the heavy steel needle through the canvas. Push, pull, pull. The thick cotton thread made a rhythmic slicing sound as it pulled tight. It was a domestic sound, a sound of mending, of putting broken things back together. Across the room, sitting at his scarred wooden desk, Silas Vance was trying not to listen to it. He held a pencil. He was staring at a logbook. He hadn't written a word in 20 minutes. Every time she pulled that thread, a strange, tight feeling coiled in his chest. This outpost hadn't seen a woman in years. It was a place for hard men, cheap whiskey, and bad memories. Clara's presence altered the very air in the room. She was small, swimming in her faded black dress, but she commanded the space simply by sitting still. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He noticed the way she moved, efficient, no wasted energy. He noticed the white cotton bandages wrapped around her hands. Gideon had cleaned her wounds last night. Silas had wanted to do it, but he knew his hands were too rough, too stained. He couldn't shake the anger that had spiked in him when he saw her bleeding. Blackwood's men had treated her like an animal. They had sent her up here to break. But looking at her now, with her back straight and her jaw set, Silas knew one thing for certain. This woman did not break. "Sheriff," Silas blinked. The rhythmic sound of the needle had stopped. Clara was looking at him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and unreadable. "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. He sat up a little straighter. "This canvas is rotted near the grommets," Clara said. Her voice was practical, businesslike. "I can patch it, but it won't hold under a heavy gale. I need heavier canvas patches. I also need more beeswax and a spool of wire core thread. The regular cotton will snap if the canvas freezes." Silas nodded. "I can wire the general store down in the valley. The supply wagon tries to make a run up here once a week, weather permitting. Write down what you need." Clara set the heavy tent aside. She walked over to the small side table where Gideon kept the coffee supplies. There was a stray piece of paper and a piece of drawing charcoal. She picked up the charcoal. She listed the items in neat, precise script. Heavy canvas yards, beeswax blocks, wire core thread. When she finished the list, she moved to the bottom of the page. It was a habit, a formality. When dealing with town council accounts, everything had to be signed. Everything had to be accounted for. She pressed the charcoal to the paper and signed her full legal name. Clara walked across the room and set the paper on Silas's desk. "Here is the requisition." "Thank you," Silas said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the paper. Clara turned and walked back to her chair by the fire. She picked up the tent and began to sew again. Push, pull, pull. Silas picked up the paper. He read the list of supplies. He nodded to himself. Simple enough. He moved his eyes down to the bottom of the page to see if she needed anything else. His eyes hit the signature. The breath stopped in his throat. It didn't catch. It simply stopped. Written in dark, smudged charcoal. Clara Hayes. The room suddenly felt incredibly small. The air thinned out. The crackle of the fire sounded like a roaring waterfall in his ears. Hayes. Silas's hand began to tremble. Just a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. He gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned bone white. He stared at the name. The letters seemed to vibrate on the page. Clara Hayes. No. It was a common name. It had to be a coincidence. The territory was full of people named Hayes. Very slowly, moving like a man underwater, Silas opened the bottom drawer of his desk. It was locked. He pulled a small brass key from his vest pocket. His fingers were clumsy. He unlocked the drawer. He reached past the spare ammunition boxes. past the old warrants. He pulled out a worn manila folder. It was the only file he kept locked away. He flipped it open. The official incident report from 4 years ago. The paper was yellowing at the edges. The ink was faded. But the name at the top of the page was clear. Deceased, Arthur Hayes. Silas looked from the file to the charcoal requisition list. Arthur Hayes. Clara Hayes. He looked across the room. She was sitting by his fire, tending to his torn gear, wearing black. The mourning dress. 4 years of mourning. The woman sitting 10 feet away from him was the widow of the man he killed. Silas couldn't breathe. The walls of the cabin were rushing in on him. The guilt, the crushing, suffocating guilt he had carried every second of the last 1,461 days, suddenly materialized into a living, breathing person in his front room. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Clara looked up, startled. Silas didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he looked into her eyes, he knew he would shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. He grabbed his hat and his heavy coat. He didn't put them on, he just held them. "I have to check the perimeter," Silas choked out. His voice was gravelly, raw. Before Clara could ask a question, Silas threw open the heavy timber door and walked out into the freezing wind. He slammed the door behind him. The cold hit him instantly, but he didn't care. He walked blindly. He waded through the deep snow, moving away from the cabin toward the tree line. When he reached the shadow of the tall pines, his legs gave out. Silas fell to his knees in the snow. He dropped his coat, he dropped his hat. He gripped his head with both hands, digging his fingers into his hair. A ragged, agonizing breath tore itself from his lungs. It sounded like a sob, but there were no tears, just pure, unadulterated pain. It's her! The realization crashed over him like a physical weight. Blackwood didn't just send a random woman to freeze on the mountain. He sent her. Why? Why would Josiah Blackwood send Arthur Hayes's widow up here? Silas's mind raced. Blackwood was a predator. Predators only moved when they were threatened, or when they wanted to hide something. Clara Hayes wasn't a threat to Blackwood down in town. Unless she was looking into things. Unless she was asking questions about how her husband really died. And if she was asking questions, Blackwood would want her silenced. What better way to silence a widow than to send her to the deadliest outpost in the territory? If the storm didn't kill her on the trail, the isolation would. And if she made it to the outpost, who was waiting for her? The sheriff who shot her husband. It was a perfectly evil design. Blackwood had weaponized Silas's own guilt against him. He had sent the ghost of Silas's past right to his front door, knowing it would break him. Silas stayed on his knees in the snow for a long time. The wind howled around him, freezing the sweat on his brow. The numbness crept into his fingers. He thought about going back inside and telling her the truth. Confessing right now. Letting her hate him. Letting her take his gun and shoot him where he stood. God knew he deserved it. But if she killed him, who would protect her? Blackwood wanted her dead. Silas knew that now. The council's order wasn't about mending tents. It was an execution order disguised as a work detail. If Silas sent her back to town on the next stagecoach, she wouldn't make it to the valley floor. Blackwood's men would see to that. If she stayed here, she was trapped in a cabin with her husband's killer. Silas slowly lifted his head. The snow was falling harder now, stinging his cheeks. He had taken Arthur Hayes's life because he was a coward. Because he had listened to the powerful men in town and acted without thinking. He had lived in the dark for 4 years because of it. He couldn't undo the bullet. He couldn't bring Arthur back. But he could save her. Silas Vance stood up. He brushed the snow from his knees. He picked up his coat and shoved his arms into the heavy sleeves. He put his hat on his head, pulling the brim low. His eyes were no longer tired. They were hard, cold as the mountain ice. He would keep her here. He wouldn't tell her the truth yet. Not until he figured out exactly what Blackwood was hiding. Not until he had the evidence to destroy the man who set them both up. He would bear her presence. He would bear the agony of looking at the woman he destroyed every single day. That would be his true penance. He would keep her safe, even if she hated him for the rest of her life when she finally found out why. Silas walked back to the cabin. His boots crunched heavily in the snow. He reached the heavy timber door. He paused for a second, listening to the muffled rhythmic sound coming from inside. Push, pull, pull. Silas opened the door. Clara didn't look up from her sewing. The firelight danced across her face. She looked peaceful, focused. Silas walked over to his desk. He took the brass key from his pocket. He locked the drawer containing Arthur Hayes's file. The click of the lock was sharp in the quiet room. He slipped the key back into his pocket. "The storm is getting worse," Silas said. His voice was steady now. The tremor was gone. "The trail is going to be impassable by nightfall." Clara finally looked up. She set the needle down. "Does that mean the supply wagon won't make it?" "It means no one is making it up here," Silas said. He met her gaze, holding it firmly. "And no one is leaving. You're going to be here for a while, Mrs. Hayes." Clara held his stare. She didn't look afraid. She just nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I have a lot of mending to do, Sheriff." "Yes," Silas said quietly, turning back to look at the storm raging outside the window. "I suppose we both do." The storm didn't break. It settled in. It laid a heavy white blanket over Pine Ridge Outpost. The snow piled high against the log walls, creeping halfway up the frosted windows. Inside, the world shrank down to the size of a single room. The stove, the table, the silence. Clara Hayes liked the silence. She used it. She sat near the fire, a heavy wool coat draped across her lap. It was Silas Vance's coat, the one he wore when he rode the high timber. It was heavy, coarse. It smelled faintly of wood smoke, pine needles, and old leather. Clara ran her thumb along a ragged tear on the left sleeve. She had expected different damage. When she heard stories of the sheriff of Pine Ridge, she pictured a brute, a man who solved problems with his fists and his gun. She expected to mend bullet holes. She expected to stitch up knife slashes from saloon brawls. That wasn't what she found. She looked closely at the torn wool. The edges were frayed and stretched, not sliced. It was a tear from catching on jagged rock. Lower down, near the hem, the fabric was scorched black. A burn mark, like a man had waded into a burning barn to pull out a frightened horse. The elbows were worn thin from leaning over tables studying maps. This wasn't the coat of a brawler. It was the coat of a man who put himself between danger and other people. It didn't make sense. The man who wore this coat was the same man who shot her husband dead. She picked up her needle, pushed it through the heavy wool, pull, tighten. Silas was across the room. He was cleaning his rifle. He did it methodically, breaking it down, oiling the parts, wiping them clean. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her since yesterday morning, when she handed him the requisition list, since he saw her name. Clara wasn't blind. She saw the way his jaw locked when he looked at her. She saw the way he kept his distance, like she was a lit stick of dynamite sitting in his front room. Gideon Brooks stepped into the cabin. He carried an armful of split firewood. He kicked the door shut behind him, stamping the snow off his boots. "Wind's shifting," Gideon announced. He dumped the wood into the iron bin next to the stove. "Drifts are getting high. We ain't seeing a supply wagon for a week, maybe 2. Silas didn't look up from his rifle. "Rations? Plenty of beans, plenty of dried beef," Gideon said. He dusted off his hands and looked over at Clara. "Hope you ain't partial to fresh vegetables, Mrs. Hayes. Because up here, an onion is considered a luxury." Clara managed a small, tight smile. "I can manage, Mr. Brooks. I'm not here for a holiday." Gideon chuckled, a low, warm sound. He walked over to the small coffee station and poured himself a cup. He leaned against the wall, watching her work. "That's the sheriff's old storm coat. He tore that up pulling a lost prospector out of a ravine 2 winters ago. Man was half frozen. Silas rigged a rope, went down in the dark, ripped his coat to hell, but he got the man out." Clara stopped sewing for a second. She looked at the jagged tear. Then she looked across the room at Silas. Silas kept his eyes on his rifle. "You talk too much, Gideon." "Just giving the lady some context," Gideon said easily. Clara set the needle down. She let the coat rest in her lap. This was an opening. She needed to know the lay of the land. She needed to know where Arthur had died. "The terrain up here is treacherous," Clara said softly. "I saw that on the ride up." "Are there many ravines like that? Valleys where a man could get lost?" Silas paused. The oiled rag in his hand went perfectly still. He slowly looked up at her. His gray eyes were guarded. "A few? Why do you ask?" "Curiosity," Clara said smoothly. She didn't blink. "I'm from town. The valley floor is flat. Up here, it seems a man could disappear and never be found, or wander into the wrong place in the dark." The tension in the room spiked. It was thick enough to cut with a knife. Silas stared at her. He knew what she was doing. She was probing. She was talking about her husband. "There's a valley," Silas said. His voice was low, careful. "About 5 miles south of here. It's a box canyon, mostly. Blind corners. Shadows get long in the afternoon. It's a bad place to be if you don't know the way." Clara filed the information away. 5 miles south, a box canyon. "Is that where the mines are?" Clara asked. Gideon shook his head. He took a sip of his coffee. "No, ma'am. The silver mines are further east. That valley south of here. That's mostly claim-jumped land. Josiah Blackwood bought it up cheap a few years back. Kicked the squatters off. Said he was going to survey it, but he never did. Just let it sit empty." Clara's heart did a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. Arthur was looking into land grabs. He was looking into Blackwood. And he died in a valley Blackwood owned. The pieces were starting to align. They were ugly, blood-stained pieces, but they were fitting together. Later that evening, the three of them sat around the heavy wooden table. Dinner was exactly what Gideon had promised: salt pork, beans, and hard biscuits. They ate by the light of a single kerosene lantern. The wind battered the log walls outside. Gideon was talking about town, about the latest edicts from the council. "They cut the wages at the lower mine again," Gideon said, shaking his head. "Told the immigrant workers they had to pay for their own pickaxes and lamp oil. Men are pulling 14-hour shifts in the dark, breathing coal dust, and they owe the company store more than they make. It's a damn shame. It's indentured servitude, plain and simple." Silas stared at his plate. He didn't eat. Clara set her fork down. She looked at Gideon. Her eyes were burning with a quiet, fierce heat. "It is more than a shame, Mr. Brooks," Clara said. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp in the quiet cabin. Both men looked at her. "No economic empire should ever be built upon the deprivation of another's freedom," Clara stated, her words measured and absolute. "It doesn't matter if it's a silver mine or a cotton field. When powerful men treat laborers as property, when they trap them in debt and deny them a living wage, they strip away their humanity." She looked directly at Silas. She wanted him to hear this. She wanted the lawman to understand exactly what kind of town he was taking orders from. "Equality is not a charitable gift bestowed by the wealthy, Sheriff Vance," Clara continued, her voice unwavering. "It is a natural right bestowed at birth. Every man in those mines has the exact same right to a decent life, and to fair treatment under the law, as Josiah Blackwood does. A badge shouldn't just protect property. It must protect people." Silas didn't look away. He met her gaze. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind outside. Silas looked at the widow sitting at his table. She was small, battered, and grieving, but she possessed a moral clarity that hit him like a physical blow. She was right. God, she was right. "You speak the truth, Mrs. Hayes," Silas said finally. His voice was a low, rough whisper. "And the law has been blind to that truth for far too long." Clara held his gaze for a second longer. Then she picked up her fork and quietly resumed eating. Silas looked down at his own hands. They were the hands that had pulled the trigger. But looking at Clara, listening to the unbreakable conviction in her voice, something inside him shifted. He didn't just want to protect her anymore. He wanted to help her tear Blackwood's empire down to the bedrock. The next morning, the snow stopped. The wind died down to a low whistle. The sky remained a flat, iron gray. The world was frozen solid. Silas and Gideon were outside. They were shoveling a path to the horse shed. The snow was packed hard and heavy. Every shovelful was a labor. Clara was alone in the cabin. She was working on a different coat today. It was an older one. Silas had pulled it from the bottom of his trunk. It was a heavy duster made of thick canvas and lined with wool. It was practically ancient. "Needs patching on the inside pockets," Silas had told her shortly before going outside. "Lining is falling apart." Clara laid the heavy coat across the table. She opened it up. The inside lining was indeed shredded. The wool was separating from the canvas shell. She ran her hand inside the deep left breast pocket. There was a hole at the bottom, a large tear. She reached her fingers past the tear, sliding her hand down into the dark, empty space between the lining and the canvas exterior. Sometimes coins or small items slipped down there. She needed to clear it out before she stitched it shut. Her fingers brushed against something. It wasn't a coin. It felt like paper. Thick, stiff paper, folded tightly. Clara frowned. She pinched the paper between her fingers and slowly pulled it up through the tear in the pocket. It was a telegram. It was old. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn soft from sitting inside the coat for years. Clara unfolded it. The telegraph office stamp at the top was dated 4 years ago, November 12th, 1874. The exact date Arthur died. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the window. Silas and Gideon were still outside, their backs turned, shoveling snow. She looked down at the telegram. The ink was faded but perfectly legible. "Sheriff Vance, Pine Ridge Outpost, urgent. Armed bandits spotted heading for South Box Canyon, heavily armed, dangerous, shoot on sight to protect county property. Do not hesitate. J. Blackwood, Council Chair." Clara stared at the words. Shoot on sight. Do not hesitate. J. Blackwood. Her hands began to shake. The paper rattled softly in the quiet cabin. Arthur wasn't armed. Arthur didn't even own a gun. He was carrying a leather satchel full of papers. Josiah Blackwood had sent a telegram to Silas Vance. He told the sheriff an armed, dangerous bandit was in the valley. He gave the order to shoot on sight. And Silas, the loyal dog of the town council, had taken his rifle, ridden out into the dark, and shot the first man he saw. He didn't check, he didn't ask questions, he just pulled the trigger. Clara felt sick. A cold, nauseating wave washed over her. Silas wasn't just careless. He was Blackwood's executioner. Blackwood pointed the weapon and Silas fired it. She quickly folded the telegram. She slipped it into the deep pocket of her black morning dress. Her heart was hammering violently. She looked at the heavy timber door. She was trapped in this cabin with the man who murdered her husband on Blackwood's orders. Outside, the freezing air bit at Silas's lungs. He drove his shovel into the snowbank. He was sweating despite the cold. Work kept the demons at bay. "Hold up," Gideon said suddenly. Silas stopped. He looked at his deputy. Gideon was staring toward the tree line, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. A figure was stumbling out of the pine trees. It was a man. He was covered in snow, dragging his left leg. He looked half dead. He collapsed into a snowbank about 50 yards from the cabin, trying to crawl forward. Silas dropped his shovel. He drew his gun and moved fast, Gideon right beside him. When they reached the man, Silas holstered his weapon. The man wasn't a threat. He was freezing to death. He wore rags. His face was blackened with frostbite. "Help!" the man croaked. His lips were cracked and bleeding. "Please." Silas grabbed the man by the shoulders and hauled him up. "Get his legs, Gideon. Bring him to the shed." not the cabin. They carried the half-frozen man into the horse shed. It smelled of hay and manure, but it blocked the wind. Silas dropped the man roughly onto a pile of dry straw. Gideon grabbed a heavy horse blanket and threw it over him. Silas stood over the man. He recognized the face. The territory was big, but Silas never forgot a face he had locked up. "Your name is Eli," Silas said. His voice was hard. "You run whiskey and steal traps down in the valley." The man shivered violently, clutching the blanket. "Storm caught me, just trying to cross the pass." "You're a long way from the valley, Eli," Gideon said, crouching down. "What are you doing up on Pine Ridge?" Eli coughed. It sounded wet and painful. "Running." "From who?" Silas demanded. Eli looked up. His eyes were wide with a desperate animal fear. "Blackwood's men. They're cleaning house. Anybody who knows anything, they're getting rid of us." Silas froze. He exchanged a sharp look with Gideon. "Knows anything about what?" Silas asked. He took a step closer, towering over the shivering man. "The old jobs," Eli wheezed. "The setups. Blackwood is tying up loose ends. He thinks the federal marshals are sniffing around the county accounts." "Be specific, Eli," Silas growled. "What setups?" Eli swallowed hard. He looked at the silver star on Silas's chest. He looked terrified. "The land grabs, the squatters, the clerk." The world seemed to stop spinning. Silas knelt down in the hay. He grabbed Eli by the lapels of his ragged coat. He pulled the man closer. "What clerk?" Silas asked. His voice was a deadly, quiet hiss. Eli trembled. "The one from town, 4 years ago, Hayes, Arthur Hayes." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. "What about him?" "I was there," Eli cried out, his voice cracking. "I worked for Blackwood back then, just running messages, doing dirty work. Blackwood wanted the clerk dead, said the man was looking into the mine ledgers, found out the workers were basically slaves, found out the deeds were forged." Silas couldn't breathe. He stared at Eli. "We lured him out," Eli confessed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Told Hayes we had a witness, someone willing to talk. Told him to meet us in the South Box Canyon at midnight. Told him to come alone." "And then?" Silas asked. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "And then Blackwood sent a wire," Eli whispered, "to the outpost, to the sheriff. Told the law there was an armed bandit in the canyon. We just hid in the rocks and watched. We watched the sheriff ride down. We watched him shoot the clerk." Eli let out a broken sob. "We didn't even have to pull a trigger. Blackwood used you, Sheriff. He used your badge to do his killing." Silas let go of Eli's coat. He stood up. He backed away, hitting the wooden wall of the shed. It was true. It was all true. He hadn't just made a tragic mistake in the dark. He had been played. He had been a pawn on Josiah Blackwood's bloody chessboard. Blackwood had orchestrated the entire night. He had lured an innocent, brave man out into the cold, and then he had pointed Silas like a loaded gun. Silas looked at his hands. They were trembling violently now. He was a murderer, but he was also a fool. Gideon stood up slowly. He looked at Silas. The deputy's eyes were full of a terrible, heavy sorrow. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Silas turned toward the door of the shed. He looked across the snow-covered yard toward the main cabin. Clara was inside. She was sitting by his fire, the widow of the man he killed, a man who died trying to expose a tyrant. Arthur Hayes wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a hero, and Silas was his executioner. Silas stepped out of the shed and into the freezing air. He knew the truth now, the whole sickening truth. But as he stared at the cabin, watching the smoke rise from the chimney, Silas didn't know that Clara had just found a piece of the truth herself. He didn't know that she had the telegram in her pocket. He didn't know that she was waiting for him, and that the fragile piece they had built was about to shatter into 1,000 irredeemable pieces. It started as a low rumble, deep in the earth. Silas Vance stopped shoveling. He leaned on the wooden handle. He looked up toward the high peaks. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. Heavy. Flat. The rumble grew. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like the mountain itself was tearing in half. "Avalanche," Gideon said. His voice was perfectly flat. They stood there for a long moment, listening. The sound echoed down the canyon walls, a terrifying roar of thousands of tons of snow and ice breaking loose. It wasn't above them. It was below them. Down by the narrow pass, the only road back to town. Only the roaring stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut and locked from the outside. "Well," Gideon said quietly. He tipped his hat back. "Nobody is coming up, and we sure aren't going down." Silas nodded slowly. He looked back at the heavy timber door of the main cabin. "We're snowed in. Could be a week, could be a month." Inside the cabin, the temperature was dropping. Clara Hayes sat close to the cast-iron stove. She had her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, but she was shivering. Deep, racking shudders that she couldn't control. The journey up the mountain had taken its toll. The stress, the freezing wind, and now the telegram burning a hole in her pocket. It was a poison working its way through her blood. When Silas and Gideon walked in, Silas noticed immediately. He took off his heavy buffalo coat. He hung it on the peg. He looked at Clara. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, but her cheeks were flushed, a bright, unnatural red. "You're sick," Silas said. He walked across the room. He didn't ask. He stated it. "I am fine," Clara said. Her teeth chattered. Silas ignored her. He took off his thick leather gloves. He reached out and pressed the back of his hand against her forehead. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. Clara froze. She looked up at him. She hated him. She knew he was a murderer. But right now, his hand was the warmest thing she had ever felt. "You have a fever," Silas said. He pulled his hand back quickly. He looked at Gideon. "Boil water. Get the spare blankets from the trunk." The next 48 hours were a blur for Clara. The fever spiked. It dragged her down into a dark, suffocating place. She dreamed of the stagecoach. She dreamed of Cobb's cruel laugh. She dreamed of a gunshot echoing in a dark canyon. But through the haze, there was a constant presence. Silas. He didn't leave her side. When she woke in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat, he was there, sitting in the heavy wooden chair next to her cot. The fire was always blazing. A damp, cool cloth was pressed to her forehead. He didn't sleep, he just watched her. His gray eyes were shadowed with a grief she couldn't understand. Not yet. On the third morning, the fever finally broke. Clara opened her eyes. The cabin was quiet. The harsh morning light filtered through the frosted glass. She took a deep breath. Her lungs ached, but the suffocating heat was gone. She turned her head. Silas was sitting in the chair. He was asleep. His head rested against the rough log wall. He looked 10 years older, exhausted, beaten down. Clara stared at him. It made no sense. This man had shot her husband. He was Josiah Blackwood's hired gun, a corrupt lawman, a killer. Yet he had spent 3 days nursing her back to health. He had touched her with absolute reverence. He had protected her from the cold. He had asked for nothing. Silas shifted. His eyes opened. He blinked against the light. He looked at her, and for a split second his guard was completely down. He just looked relieved. "Your fever broke," Silas said. His voice was a dry croak. "It did," Clara said. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. She felt weak, but clear-headed. Silas stood up. He walked over to the stove. He poured a cup of warm water from the kettle. He brought it back to her. He handed it to her carefully, making sure his fingers didn't brush hers. Clara took the tin cup. She drank. The water felt like life itself. She lowered the cup. She looked at the sheriff. "You haven't slept," she said. "I'll sleep tonight," Silas replied. He took a step back. putting distance between them. Always keeping that distance. Clara gripped the tin cup. She needed him to understand something. She needed to set the record straight, even if he was her enemy. "You didn't have to do this," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the rhythmic, steady cadence she used when she meant every word. Silas looked at the floor. "You were sick under my roof. It was my duty." "It was more than duty," Clara corrected him. She sat up a little straighter. She looked him dead in the eye. "Listen to me, Silas, because people in town have forgotten this. Compassion between people in times of adversity is what defines our humanity. Caring for a stranger without seeking anything in return proves that empathy is always stronger than judgment." Silas slowly raised his eyes. He met her gaze. "A man is not measured by the power he wields," Clara continued, her words ringing clear in the silent cabin. "He is measured by how he treats the vulnerable when no one else is watching. You have shown me a profound kindness, and for that I am grateful." Silas stared at her. The words hit him hard. She was thanking him. The woman whose life he had destroyed was thanking him for a cup of water and a cool cloth. The guilt twisted in his gut like a rusted knife. It was unbearable. He took a slow, heavy breath. "I'm glad you're feeling better, Mrs. Hayes," Silas said. His voice was thick with a bitterness he couldn't hide. "But don't make me out to be a saint. I only hope you still believe those words when you know the whole truth about me." He turned on his heel. He walked to the door. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the freezing wind. Clara watched the door close. She set the tin cup down. She reached into the pocket of her dress. Her fingers brushed the folded edge of the telegram. "I already know the truth," she thought, "and you are going to pay for it." 2 days later, the outpost was quiet. Gideon was down at the shed, tending to the horses. Silas was out on the perimeter, breaking through the snowdrifts to check the warning lines. Clara was alone. She was fully recovered. The fever was a memory. Her strength had returned, and with her strength came her focus. She needed more evidence. The telegram was a smoking gun, but it only proved Blackwood gave an order. It didn't prove Silas knew Arthur was unarmed. She needed something from Silas himself. A confession, a report, something she could take to a federal judge. She stood up from her sewing chair. She walked over to Silas's desk. It was a heavy piece of oak, scarred and stained with ink. She opened the top drawers. Blank paper, spare lead for pencils, a tin of tobacco. She tried the bottom drawer. It was locked. Clara frowned. She tugged on the brass handle. It didn't budge. She knelt down, examining the lock. It was a simple mechanism. She looked back at her sewing kit. She walked over, picked up a heavy steel hairpin, and walked back to the desk. She wasn't a thief. She was a teacher, a seamstress, a widow. But desperation teaches you new skills. She slid the pin into the lock. She wiggled it, pressed up, click. The drawer popped open. Clara pulled it out. The drawer smelled of old paper and brass polish. There were boxes of ammunition, a spare holster, and tucked in the very back, beneath a heavy leather ledger, was a manila folder. It looked old. The edges were soft and worn. Clara pulled it out. She sat in Silas's chair. She opened the folder. It was a stack of official incident reports, but they weren't the final copies. They were drafts, written in Silas's heavy, blocky handwriting. Words were crossed out. Sentences were rewritten. She flipped past the first few pages. Then she stopped. The date at the top of the page, November 13th, 1874, the day after Arthur died. Clara's hands began to shake. She laid the paper flat on the desk. She read the words, "Responded to telegram from Chairman Blackwood. Arrived at South Box Canyon at 2300 hours. Sighted a male figure in the rocks." Clara swallowed hard. She read the next line. It was heavily underlined. "I shot Arthur Hayes. The responsibility is entirely mine. I did not verify a weapon. I fired on command." The air in the room vanished. Clara stared at the ink. It was black, bold, Unapologetic. I fired on command. She pulled the telegram from her pocket. She laid it next to the drafted report. The two pieces of paper sat side by side on the scarred wood. The complete, horrific picture. Blackwood sent the order. Silas obeyed. He didn't check for a gun. He didn't care. He was a loyal dog off the leash. They had conspired. They had murdered her husband to cover up Blackwood's crimes, and Silas had hidden the truth in a locked drawer for 4 years. A cold, terrifying calm washed over Clara. It wasn't panic. It wasn't grief. It was pure, distilled fury. She looked up. Hanging on the wall next to the desk by a leather strap was Silas's spare revolver, a heavy Colt .45. Clara stood up. She reached out. Her hand didn't tremble. She pulled the heavy gun from the holster. The metal was freezing. She checked the cylinder. It was fully loaded. She cocked the hammer back. The click echoed loudly in the empty cabin. She turned and faced the heavy timber door. She waited. 10 minutes passed. Then the sound of boots on the wooden porch. The latch lifted. The door swung open. A gust of freezing wind blew into the room. Silas walked in. He was brushing snow off his hat. He kicked the door shut behind him. He didn't look up immediately. He was exhausted. "Snow's packing hard on the ridge," Silas said to the room. He looked up. He froze. Clara was standing 10 feet away. The heavy Colt was raised, leveled directly at his chest. Her eyes were black, empty of any warmth, empty of the compassion she had spoken of just 2 days ago. Silas's eyes darted from the barrel of the gun to the desk. He saw the open drawer. He saw the manila folder. He saw the telegram. He understood instantly. He didn't reach for his own weapon. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. He just stood there. "You found it," Silas said quietly. "I found all of it," Clara said. Her voice was like cracking ice. "The telegram, the drafted report, the truth. You didn't make a mistake, Silas. You executed him." "Clara." "Do not say my name," she shouted. Her voice shook the walls. "You lost the right to say my name the second you pulled that trigger. You took my husband, you took Lily's father, and you did it for Josiah Blackwood." Silas took a slow breath. He looked at the gun pointed at his heart. He deserved it. He had known this moment was coming for 4 years. "Saddle a horse," Clara commanded. "Now." Silas frowned slightly. "What?" "Saddle a horse," Clara repeated, her grip tightening on the heavy grip of the Colt. "I am leaving. I am taking these papers to the federal marshal in Denver. And if you try to stop me, I will put a bullet through your chest and step over you on my way out." Silas looked at her. He looked at the window. The snow was blowing sideways. The trail was buried under 10 feet of avalanche debris. "You won't make it a mile," Silas said flatly. "The pass is blocked. The wind chill will kill you before sundown." "I would rather freeze in the snow than spend another second breathing the same air as a murderer," Clara spat. Silas didn't move. He looked at the woman he had wronged. He looked at her absolute, terrifying courage. She was going to walk out into a deadly storm just to see justice done. He couldn't let her do that. Slowly, deliberately, Silas reached behind him. Clara gripped the gun tighter. "Don't!" Silas didn't draw his weapon. He grabbed the heavy iron bolt on the timber door. He slid it across. It locked with a loud, final thud. He pulled the heavy brass key from his pocket. He tossed it onto the floor far away from both of them. Clara's eyes widened. "Unlock that door." "No," Silas said. He took one step forward, just one. Clara aimed the gun higher, pointing it right at his face. "I will shoot you." "Then shoot me," Silas said. His voice was perfectly calm. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted his death. "I am not going to let you walk out into a blizzard to be hunted down by Blackwood. I am keeping you here." "You are a coward!" Clara screamed. "Yes," Silas agreed softly. "I was. But I'm not anymore." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. She wanted to pull the trigger. She wanted him to bleed. But he wasn't acting like a hired killer. He was acting like a man who wanted to be punished. She held the gun steady. She needed him to understand the gravity of his crimes. A man who hides behind a badge to commit murder is worse than a common outlaw, Clara said. Every word was a hammer blow. Truth is the only foundation for a civilized society, Silas. Silence in the face of evil is complicity. A person can only find true redemption when they step into the light and use their voice to defend the truth, even if it destroys them. You hid in the dark. You are complicit. Silas listened to her. He absorbed every word. They hurt more than a bullet ever could, because they were entirely true. "You're right," Silas said. He unbuckled his gun belt. He let it drop heavily to the floorboards. He was completely unarmed now. He looked at her, his gray eyes burning with a desperate, terrible honesty. "You can shoot me right now, Clara," Silas said quietly. "God knows I owe you a life. But if you want to destroy Josiah Blackwood, if you want real justice for Arthur, you are going to put that gun down. And you are going to listen to the entire truth first." The heavy Colt .45 did not waver. Clara held it with both hands. Her finger rested against the cold iron of the trigger. Her knuckles were white. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Silas stood in front of her. His gun belt lay on the floorboards. He had locked them both inside. He was entirely at her mercy. "Tell me," Clara whispered. The words tore out of her throat. "Tell me exactly how my husband died." Silas didn't look away. He didn't blink. He met her dark, furious eyes. "It was raining," Silas began. His voice was hollow, stripped of all defense. "Freezing rain. Blackwood sent the wire. He said an armed bandit was moving through the South Canyon. Said the man had already shot a deputy down in the valley. It was a lie, but I didn't know that. I didn't check." He took a slow breath. The memories were a physical weight on his chest. "I rode out, alone. I wanted to prove I was the law. I wanted to be the man Blackwood said I was. I reached the canyon just before midnight. The shadows were deep. The rain was blinding." Clara listened. The cabin was dead quiet, save for the howling wind outside. "I saw movement in the rocks," Silas continued. "A shadow, stepping out into the clearing. He had something in his hand. It was dark, rectangular. I thought it was a rifle." Clara swallowed hard. A tear finally broke loose, tracking down her pale cheek. She knew what Arthur had in his hand. "I shouted for him to drop it," Silas said. "The wind swallowed my voice." He turned toward me. He raised his hands. He was trying to shield his face from the rain. I saw the movement. My blood was running hot. I had the order from the council burning in my head. Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, they were wet. I pulled the trigger. The words hung in the air. A death sentence. "I hit him center mass," Silas whispered. "He fell backward. He didn't even cry out. He just fell. I rode up to the body. I dismounted. I kept my gun drawn. I walked over to kick his rifle away." Silas looked down at his own empty hands. There was no rifle. It was a leather book, a ledger, and a stack of papers. They were scattered in the mud. He was wearing a plain wool suit, no gun belt, no weapon. He was just a man, a terrified man. Clara's arms began to tremble. The heavy gun grew heavier. "I knelt down beside him," Silas said. His voice cracked. He didn't try to hide it. "He was still breathing, just barely. He looked up at me. He wasn't angry. He was just confused. He tried to speak. He looked at my badge. Then he looked at the papers in the mud. He tried to reach for them." "What did he say?" Clara demanded. Her voice broke. "What were his last words?" Silas looked at her. The pain in his gray eyes was absolute. "He said your name." Silas breathed out. He said, "Tell Clara." And then he was gone. A ragged sob tore itself from Clara's chest. She squeezed her eyes shut. The gun dipped just an inch. Arthur hadn't died in a crossfire. He hadn't died a nameless victim. He died trying to protect the truth, staring into the face of a man who didn't bother to ask his name before shooting. "I sat there in the mud for an hour," Silas said. "I read the papers. I saw what Blackwood was doing. I saw the trap. Blackwood used me. He turned me into a murderer." "So you hid," Clara spat, opening her eyes. The fire returned to them. "You buried the truth. You wrote a false report. You let the town think my husband was a criminal who wandered into a gunfight." "Yes," Silas said. "I did." "Why?" Clara screamed. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you ride back into town and arrest Blackwood?" "Because I was a coward," Silas stated. The truth of it was ugly, but he laid it bare on the floor between them. Blackwood owned the judge. He owned the marshals. If I brought the papers in, he would have destroyed them. He would have had me hanged, or worse, he would have come after you. Silas took a step closer. The barrel of the gun was inches from his chest. "But mostly," Silas whispered, "I hid because I couldn't look you in the eye. I couldn't face the woman whose life I had shattered. I exiled myself up here. I thought if I froze on this mountain it would be enough. I thought my guilt was my punishment." Clara stared at him. The anger was still there. A roaring, raging fire. But beneath it a cold, hard clarity was forming. She looked at the man in front of her. He wasn't a monster. He was a broken, terrified man who had made a catastrophic mistake and lacked the courage to fix it. He was pathetic. But pathetic men didn't normally confess. Pathetic men didn't hand over their guns and ask for the bullet. Clara slowly lowered the revolver. She didn't drop it. She kept it in her hand. But she lowered the barrel to the floor. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He didn't move. He waited for her judgment. "You think your guilt is a punishment?" Clara asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, rhythmic, measured. Silas didn't answer. "Guilt is an indulgence, Silas," Clara said. Her words cut through the room like a razor. "It is a selfish luxury. You sit up here in the snow, punishing yourself, thinking that balances the scales. It doesn't." She took a step toward him. "Listen to me," Clara stated, locking her eyes onto his. "Your greatest sin wasn't the stray bullet in the dark. You were tricked. You were a fool. But your greatest sin was what you did the next morning. It was your silence." She lifted her chin. Her posture was uncompromising. "Silence in the face of evil is complicity, Silas. When you know a tyrant is hurting people, and you choose to look away to save your own conscience, you become his partner. A person can only find true redemption when they step into the light and use their voice to defend the truth, even if it destroys them. You hid in the dark. You protected Josiah Blackwood by protecting yourself." The words struck Silas. They shattered the last remnants of the prison he had built for himself. He had thought his isolation was noble. She was telling him it was just another form of hiding, and she was absolutely right. "I know," Silas said. His voice was a low rasp. "You're right. I have been hiding." Clara looked at the drafted report on the desk. She looked at the telegram. "I came up here to find the truth," Clara said. "I found it. But I cannot bring Blackwood down alone. He has men, he has money, he has the council." She looked back at Silas. "I do not forgive you," Clara said flatly. "I may never forgive you." "I don't expect you to," Silas replied. "But," Clara continued, her grip on the heavy Colt tightening, "if you truly want to pay for what you did, you will not do it by bleeding out on my floor. You will do it by standing up. You will help me tear Josiah Blackwood's empire down to the dirt. You will ride back into that town, you will stand before a federal judge, and you will confess exactly what you did and who ordered you to do it." Silas stared at her. The sheer, unbreakable strength of the woman humbled him. She wasn't asking for blood. She was demanding justice. "If I do that," Silas said quietly, "I will hang, or I will spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary." "Yes," Clara said. She didn't flinch. "You will." Silas looked at the floor. He looked at his badge resting on the desk. He had disgraced it. But he had one last chance to use it for what it was meant for. He looked up at Clara. "All right," Silas Vance said. The heavy, crushing weight he had carried for 4 years began to crack. A strange, terrifying peace settled over him. "I'm your man, Clara. My gun, my badge, my life. They are yours to spend." Clara nodded once, a sharp, brief motion. She walked over to the desk. She set the heavy Colt down. She carefully folded the telegram and the drafted report and placed them into the pocket of her black dress. "Then we have a great deal of work to do," Clara said. "As soon as the snow clears." The mountain surrendered 5 days later. The blizzard broke. The wind died to a whisper. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, casting a blinding, brilliant light across the deep snow of Pine Ridge. The silence was deafening. Silas stood on the porch of the outpost. He had his heavy coat on. His gun belt was strapped tight around his waist. The Colt was loaded. He had spent the last 5 days planning with Clara and Gideon. They knew Blackwood would come. If the storm didn't kill Clara, Blackwood would send men to finish the job. He couldn't leave loose ends. Gideon was positioned up in the loft of the horse shed, a repeating rifle resting on the wooden sill. Hidden. Waiting. Clara was inside the cabin, out of sight. The sound of breaking crust reached Silas's ears. Horses, heavy ones, plowing through the deep drifts on the trail. Silas didn't move. He stood on the porch, his hands resting naturally at his sides. He watched the tree line. 5 riders broke through the pines. At the front rode Josiah Blackwood. He was a thick man, dressed in expensive furs and a fine felt hat. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a banker. But the 4 men riding behind him were rough, hired guns. Hard men with repeating rifles resting across their saddles. Blackwood pulled his massive black stallion to a halt 30 yards from the porch. The horse snorted, breath pluming in the cold air. "Sheriff Vance," Blackwood called out. His voice was jovial, fake. "Glad to see you survived the freeze. We were worried about you boys up here." Silas didn't smile. "We managed." Blackwood looked around the empty yard. He looked at the smoking chimney. "Council sent a woman up here right before the storm hit. A seamstress, Widow Hayes. Did she make it?" "She did," Silas said. "Ah, a relief," Blackwood smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Well, the council decided the outpost isn't safe for a woman of her delicate constitution. I brought an escort. We're here to take her back down to the valley." "She isn't leaving," Silas said. His voice was a flat line. Blackwood's smile faded. He shifted in his saddle. The men behind him subtly moved their hands closer to their rifles. "It wasn't a request, Silas," Blackwood said, his voice dropping the friendly act. "Bring the widow out. Now." While Blackwood's attention was fixed entirely on Silas, he didn't notice the back door of the cabin open. He didn't notice Clara Hayes slip out, moving quietly through the deep trench Silas had dug the day before. Clara moved with purpose. She wasn't running away, she was moving toward the horses Blackwood's men had tied to the hitching post near the tree line when they first approached. Specifically, she was moving toward Blackwood's spare horse, the pack horse. Arthur's notes had mentioned a ledger, a physical book where Blackwood kept the real numbers. The blackmail. The debts. Blackwood never let it out of his sight. He wouldn't leave it in town if he thought federal marshals were sniffing around. He would bring it with him. Clara reached the pack horse. She kept low. She unbuckled the heavy leather saddlebag. Her fingers brushed against cold leather. A thick book. She pulled it out. She opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with names. Next to the names were numbers, debts, interest rates that were mathematically impossible to pay off. It wasn't a list of employees, it was a list of slaves, immigrant workers, desperate men trapped in the mines, their lives owned completely by the man sitting on the horse 30 yards away. This was it. This was what Arthur had found. This was why he died. "I said, bring her out," Blackwood barked, his patience gone. One of his thugs raised a rifle. "I'm right here." The voice cut across the snowy yard. Blackwood twisted in his saddle. Clara Hayes stepped out from behind the horse shed. She walked straight into the blinding sunlight. She wasn't wearing a coat. The wind whipped her black morning dress around her ankles. In her hands, held up for Blackwood to see, was the thick leather ledger. Blackwood's face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks instantly. "Where did you get that?" Blackwood snapped. Panic edged into his voice. "From your saddlebag," Clara said. Her voice carried across the snow, clear and rhythmic. "Arthur sent me a letter before he died. He told me about the second ledger. He told me you were buying men, not labor." "Put that down, you stupid woman," Blackwood growled, drawing his revolver. "Drop it, Blackwood," Silas roared. His Colt was out and leveled at the Baron in a fraction of a second. Above them, the distinct clack-clack of a lever-action rifle echoed from the shed loft. Gideon racked a round into the chamber. The barrel pointed dead at Blackwood's chest. The 4 hired guns froze. They were outgunned. They were trapped in deep snow. Blackwood looked at Silas. His upper lip curled in a vicious sneer. "You think you can turn on me, Silas? You're a dog. I own you. You pulled the trigger on that woman's husband. You're just as guilty as I am." "I am," Silas said. He didn't deny it. He didn't hide. "And I will face a judge for it. But you won't be buying your way out of this one, Josiah." Blackwood laughed. It was a desperate, ugly sound. "A judge? Over what, a book of numbers? Those men in the mines are nothing. They're dirt. They owe me money. They work to pay it off. It's commerce, Silas. They are commodities. You don't hang a man for running a business." Silas Vance stepped off the porch. He walked into the snow. He didn't take his eyes off Blackwood. He didn't lower his gun. He thought about Arthur Hayes dying in the mud. He thought about Clara, pushing a frozen wagon wheel with bleeding hands. "The law might be blinded by your money, Blackwood," Silas declared. His voice boomed across the mountain, filled with a righteous, furious clarity. "But human freedom is inviolable. No man is a commodity. No man is property to be bought and traded on a ledger." Blackwood bared his teeth. He raised his gun toward Clara. "Arthur Hayes did not die in vain," Silas shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. "He died for the absolute truth that human beings are not yours to own," Blackwood fired. He didn't aim at Silas. He aimed at Clara. Silas was faster. He had spent 4 years practicing for a gunfight he hoped would never come. Bang! Silas's Colt fired a split second before Blackwood's. The heavy .45 caliber bullet struck Blackwood in the right shoulder. The impact spun the heavy man backward. His shot went wild, burying itself into the timber of the shed, miles away from Clara. Blackwood screamed, dropping his revolver into the snow. He tumbled out of the saddle, hitting the ground hard. "Hold your fire!" Silas roared at the 4 hired guns. "Drop your weapons, or my deputy puts a rifle round through your skulls." The hired guns looked at Blackwood writhing in the snow. They looked at Silas's smoking gun. They dropped their rifles. They weren't paid enough to die on a frozen mountain. Silas walked forward. The snow crunched heavily under his boots. He reached Blackwood. The Baron was clutching his bleeding shoulder, cursing in the snow. Silas stood over him. He looked down at the man who had ruined his life, the man who had turned him into a killer. It would be so easy to cock the hammer back, to put a bullet between Blackwood's eyes. The anger burned in his veins. But Silas looked past Blackwood. He looked at Clara. She stood in the snow, clutching the ledger to her chest. She wasn't looking at Blackwood. She was looking at Silas, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Silas uncocked the hammer. He holstered his weapon. "Gideon," Silas called out, his voice steady and calm. "Get the rope. Bind his hands. We're taking the chairman to Denver. The federal marshal's going to want to read that book." Silas turned his back on Josiah Blackwood. He walked over to Clara. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at the ledger in her hands. The proof. The justice her husband died for. "It's over," Silas said quietly. Clara looked at the smoking barrel of his holstered gun. She looked at the blood on the snow. She took a deep, trembling breath. The heavy, suffocating weight of the last 4 years finally began to lift from her shoulders. "No, Silas," Clara said, her voice softer than it had been in days. "It is just beginning." Spring came late to the territory, but it came hard. The ice broke, first in the high rivers, then down in the valley. The snow turned to slush, and the slush turned to mud. The bitter wind lost its teeth. The sun finally felt warm on the skin. And with the thaw, the iron grip of Josiah Blackwood finally broke. It didn't take long once the federal marshal arrived. Silas had sent Gideon riding hard for Denver the moment the pass was clear. The marshal came with a judge. They didn't need a jury to see the truth. Clara handed over the heavy leather ledger. That book was a hanging rope made of numbers. Blackwood stood in the courtroom with his arm in a sling. He tried to buy his way out. He tried to threaten the judge. None of it worked. The ink on the pages was a confession to slavery, to extortion, to murder. They put Blackwood in heavy iron chains. They loaded him onto a fortified train heading east to a federal penitentiary. He would never see the Colorado mountains again. The day the train left, the mine gates opened. Hundreds of men walked out of the dark. Immigrant workers, fathers, sons. Men who had been told their lives were nothing more than a debt on a page. They walked into the sunlight. Free men. Arthur Hayes's name was printed on the front page of the Territory newspaper the next morning. He wasn't listed as a casualty of a random gunfight. He was named a hero. The man who found the truth. The man who laid the groundwork for their freedom. Arthur's death meant something. It changed the world. Clara Hayes stood in the center of an empty room. It was a small storefront on Main Street. It smelled of old pine, dust, and possibility. The windows were dirty. The floorboards were scuffed. But the roof was sound. Clara held a broom in her hands. She was sweeping. She wasn't wearing black today. For the first time in 4 years, she wore a simple dress of dark blue cotton. The morning was over. She pushed the dirt toward the open door. The spring breeze drifted in, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. She heard boots on the wooden boardwalk outside. Heavy steps, deliberate. They stopped right outside the open door. Clara leaned against her broom. She looked up. Silas Vance stood in the doorway. He looked different. The heavy buffalo storm coat was gone. He wore a plain canvas work jacket, a simple cotton shirt. But that wasn't the biggest change. The heavy leather gun belt was missing from his waist, and the silver star was gone from his chest. Clara stopped sweeping. She looked at the faded patch on his shirt where the badge used to sit. "You turned it in," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded slowly. He stepped into the shop. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked around the empty room, taking in the bare walls and the dusty floor. "I did," Silas said. His voice was quiet, steady. "Why?" Clara asked. Silas looked at her. The exhaustion that had haunted his gray eyes for 4 years was gone. There was a profound sadness there, yes. But it was a clean sadness. The poison of the secret was gone. "Because I broke the oath," Silas said simply. "A badge is a heavy thing, Clara. It gives a man the power over life and death. I proved 4 years ago that I wasn't wise enough to carry that weight. I let powerful men blind me. I won't ever put myself in a position to let that happen again." Clara leaned the broom against the wall. She walked closer to him. "The town needs a sheriff," she said. "The town has one," Silas replied. A faint, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Gideon Brooks. The mayor pinned the star on him this morning. He's a good man. Better than I ever was. He'll keep this valley straight." Clara nodded. She agreed. Gideon was a righteous man. She looked at Silas. He looked like an ordinary man now. Without the gun, without the badge, he was just a man who had made a terrible mistake. and who had risked everything to finally make it right. "What will you do now?" Clara asked. Silas shifted his weight. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred. "I don't know," Silas admitted. "I saved some money over the years. Never had much to spend it on up at the outpost. I figured I'd find work, hard work, something with my hands, something quiet." He looked up at her. He didn't step closer. He kept his distance. He always kept his distance. "I came to say goodbye," Silas said. The words were heavy. "I figured you wouldn't want to see my face around town. I figured the sight of me is just a reminder of the worst day of your life. So I'm riding out, heading north, going to start over where nobody knows my name." Clara listened to him. She watched him. He was still punishing himself. He had faced down Blackwood. He had confessed to the judge. He had cleared Arthur's name. He had surrendered his power. And yet, he still thought he had to exile himself to the cold. Clara took a step forward. She closed the distance between them. She didn't stop until she was standing less than 2 feet away from him. Silas froze. He looked down at her, his eyes wide with quiet surprise. "Silas Vance," Clara said. Her voice was firm. It held that steady, rhythmic cadence. "Look at me." He met her eyes. "You are not running away again," Clara stated. "You spent 4 years hiding on a frozen mountain. You are not going to spend the rest of your life hiding in another territory." "Clara," Silas whispered, "I killed him. I owe you." "You owe me exactly what you just gave me," Clara interrupted. "You gave me the truth. You gave Arthur his dignity back, and you freed hundreds of men from a tyrant." She took a slow, deep breath. She needed him to hear this. She needed him to understand the bedrock of the life they were both about to walk into. "Listen to me, Silas," Clara said. Her words were clear, unmistakable. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means choosing not to let the past imprison our future. You have restored Arthur's justice. You stood in the light. And now it is time to respect yourself again." Silas stared at her. His breath hitched in his chest. "Every person has the fundamental right to start over when they have chosen to live true to their conscience," Clara continued, her voice ringing out in the empty shop. "You have lived true to yours. You do not have to carry the cross anymore. I am putting it down, and I expect you to do the same." The silence in the room was absolute. Silas Vance stood perfectly still. The words washed over him. They sank deep into the cracked, dry earth of his soul. It was like water hitting a desert. She wasn't just letting him off the hook. She was demanding that he live. She was telling him that he was still a man, and that he still had worth. A single tear broke loose from Silas's eye. It traced a clean line through the dust on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "You are a terrifyingly strong woman, Clara Hayes," Silas whispered. "I had to be," Clara said softly. She stepped back. The intense moment broke, settling into a comfortable, easy quiet. She looked around the empty room. "I'm opening a dressmaking shop," Clara announced, changing the subject with a smooth, practical grace. "I signed the lease this morning. Women in this town need fine clothes, not just morning dresses and work aprons. I'm going to bring some color back to this valley." Silas looked around the bare walls. He cleared his throat. "It's a good room," Silas said. He ran a hand along the rough timber of the wall. "Good bones, but you don't have anywhere to put your fabric or your threads." "I know," Clara said. She picked up her broom again. "I ordered some lumber. It arrives tomorrow. I suppose I will have to figure out how to build shelves." Silas stopped. He looked at the wall. Then he looked at Clara. "I'm a fair carpenter," Silas said slowly. "Built the horse shed up at Pine Ridge myself. It stood through 4 blizzards." Clara smiled. It was a small smile, but it reached her eyes. "Is that so?" she asked. "It is," Silas nodded. "I have my own tools, a good hammer, a level. I could build those shelves for you, if you wanted the help." I wouldn't charge you for the labor." Clara leaned on the broom. She looked at the man standing in her shop. He wasn't the sheriff who shot her husband. He wasn't the ghost of Pine Ridge. He was just Silas, a man looking for a quiet day's work, a man trying to start over. "I think I would like that very much, Silas," Clara said. Silas put his hat back on. He adjusted the brim. For the first time in 4 years, his shoulders weren't hunched against an invisible weight. He stood tall. "I'll be by at sunrise tomorrow," Silas said, "with my tools." "I will put a pot of coffee on the stove," Clara replied. "Black, like river mud." Silas chuckled. It was a rusty sound, but it was real. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He turned and walked out the door. Clara stood in the center of the room. She watched him walk down the boardwalk. He didn't look back. He just walked steady, moving toward the sun. Clara went back to sweeping. The floor was getting cleaner with every stroke. The dust was flying out the door, carried away by the spring wind. It wasn't a fairy tale. The scars were still there. They would always be there. Clara would always miss Arthur. Silas would always remember the cold rain of that night. But scars didn't mean you were broken. Scars just meant you had survived the wound. Tomorrow, the lumber would arrive. Tomorrow, Silas would bring his hammer and nails. They wouldn't talk about the past. They wouldn't need to. They would talk about the wood. They would talk about the measurements. They would build something new, from the ground up, together. This tale honors courage, dignity, and the power of a woman who refuses to let injustice win. On this channel, we tell Western cowboy stories filled with frontier love, motherly devotion, kindness, compassion, and the deep humanity that connects us all. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
Based on the Western story of Clara Hayes, Sheriff Silas Vance, Arthur Hayes, and the corruption hidden beneath Pine Ridge. In the end, this story is not only about a frozen mountain outpost, a widow seeking justice, or a sheriff haunted by the bullet he fired. It is a story about truth, conscience, and the heavy price of silence. Clara Hayes entered Pine Ridge as a woman others believed could be thrown away, a poor widow sent into the cold because powerful men thought her life had no value. But Clara proved that dignity does not come from wealth, status, or strength in the eyes of society. Dignity is something every human being is born with. And no man, no council, no badge, and no empire has the right to take it away. Through her courage, we learn that grief can become a force for justice, and that even a broken heart can stand taller than those who hide behind power. Sheriff Silas Vance teaches us another painful truth. Guilt alone is not redemption. For years, he punished himself with isolation, cold, and loneliness, believing that suffering in silence could somehow balance the life he had taken. But the story shows us that hiding from the truth, even when we are ashamed, only allows evil to grow stronger. True redemption begins when a person stops protecting their own pain and chooses to protect others instead. Silas could not bring Arthur Hayes back, but he could finally stand in the light, confess what had happened, and use his badge for justice instead of fear. His journey reminds us that a man is not defined only by his worst mistake, but by whether he has the courage to face it, repair what he can, and accept the cost of the truth. The story also reminds us that compassion is one of the strongest forms of humanity. In the middle of snow, sickness, anger, and betrayal, small acts of care still mattered. A warm fire, a cup of water, a hand extended in the cold, a life protected when it would have been easier to look away. These moments show that even in a harsh world, kindness can survive. Clara did not forgive easily, and she did not have to. Forgiveness is not something owed to the guilty, but justice, truth, and human dignity are owed to everyone. That is the deeper meaning of this tale. We must never treat people as expendable, never allow power to decide whose life matters, and never stay silent when the innocent are crushed beneath greed. So when the snow finally settles over Pine Ridge, what remains is more than revenge. What remains is a lesson about courage, mercy, and moral responsibility. The world may be full of men like Josiah Blackwood, who measure human lives by profit and power. But it is also full of people like Clara, who refuse to bow, and people like Silas, who still have one last chance to choose what is right. This story asks every listener to look inward and remember, truth may be delayed, but it cannot be buried forever. Justice may come slowly, but it begins with one brave voice. And compassion, even in the coldest places, can keep the human soul alive.